The oldest Gen Z are around 26, 27 years old.
Yeah.
And then the youngest, I think, are early teens.
Yeah.
So the mid of Gen Z is supposed to be entering the workforce right now, but we're
Okay.
seeing a lot of, they're called NEETs.
Yeah.
Not in education. What is
Employment or training.
Right, there you go.
And so, listen, for the sake of the argument, I'll track you wherever you're going. But that news story is an alarm bell, because I would make that almost an exclusively cultural argument.
Real quick, the reason why I asked about the point at which if you tax people too much, the system breaks, is that we are going to have, in 10 years, 58 million boomers projected, 70-ish million millennials. I know millennials aren't dying of old age, but there's general mortality. It's kind of sad. And Gen Z will be around 68 million. So we're going to need a labor force to support, in 10 years, the boomers on Social Security, 50 million. But there's only going to be 40 some odd million Gen Alpha to begin entering that workforce. The solution then for that issue is going to be, we're going to have to tax people more.
Or immigration.
Indeed.
Or immigration. Yeah.
But immigration doesn't solve the problem. It does band-aid some of it. The issue with mass migration, as we've seen from the Democratic Party, which is largely unskilled labor, is that labor force of a country is going to be divided by, a wave of from high skill down to low skill. You can't just flood the low skill bracket and leave the mid to high skills.
Which is why I argue about integration, which is I think that these are largely, listen, Econoboy,
but it's not integration. You can have a Chinatown where they only speak Chinese if they're producing things to trade with other people. The issue is normally the way the labor force expands is that a new generation enters the low skill portion of the workforce and then gains those skills over time. And then some people jump to the high point. Some people are geniuses. Some people are dumb. But if you flood 20 million non-skilled labor, you're going to keep seeing a collapse of the mid-range and the high range, meaning all of the higher level functions are going to be strained and collapse, and you can't have everyone fighting over the same jobs in the low.
Econoboy, if you'll indulge me. And so when I say integration, I don't specifically mean Asians in Chinatown need to speak English, right? What I mean is that they need to go to, not the Asians in particular, right? Let's be real.
They go to school a lot.
Yeah, like 80% of we're talking about Hispanics. 80% of immigration into the United States is going to be Hispanics, right? So what I'm talking about with integration is we need to look at school. And I hate that conservatives are retreating from school. We need to look at that as a socialization apparatus in order to prepare the next generation for the workforce. And we have looked at it that way for a very long time. My frustration with MAGA and some of the walking away from education movements and the gutting of the DOE, we don't have to get into details. But the reason why I get frustrated with that is because effectively what you're saying is every man for himself. And so we have people who are going to be homeschooled. We have people who are going to go to private school. They might do well individually. But when we're talking about on a culture-wide basis, if we're decreasing the quality of education, then effectively what we're not doing is we're not socializing that next generation, and we're making it more difficult. You're saying that flooding the bottom tier. I would want the bottom tier within 2 or 3 generations to be climbing to the higher echelons. Why not?
I'm
Irish. I'm a mud-dwelling, bog-dwelling, rock
from Ireland?
No, but
and how many generations has your family been here?
3 or 4.
3 or 4 generations of social development. You can't take people who grew up on farms and ask them to go code. It doesn't work.
Sure, but that's what I'm talking about, a 3 or 4 generational project.
Well,
nation building over 100 years.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, if
we're going to have an immediate problem that immigration won't solve.
Sure.
Well, obviously, immigration has its own issues, right? So you do have to have a sort of methodical and thoughtful immigration process. But again, these are all separate conversations, right? So, the welfare,
I don't think so, bud.
welfare
you keep saying
state.
That, but I don't think they are.
Okay, so do you agree?
You cannot advocate for mass spending on welfare while ignoring the collapsing labor force, the fluctuation in the tax base, and the wealth resources.
Well,
the welfare state.
Increase the taxes because we can make up for the wealth. Well, hold on, real quick.
Because
you said that
you held up real quick several times.
Okay,
so let me.
I'll write it down
here. Yeah, write it down. The point is to say the welfare state is a question of distribution, right?
Sure.
That is the question of the welfare state. We've got all these groups of non-workers. We've got, and I don't want to repeat them, but the 6 groups that I mentioned.
All the ones that we actually care about.
Right. So we've got all these groups of non-workers, people who struggle to work, things like that. And then we've got all these people who are working. Whether we have a declining population, deindustrialization, struggles to climb the value chain, questions about the tax code, whatever, right?
Okay.
Those are all relevant questions. Those are all reasonable questions to ask, okay? But the question of the welfare state is, how do we want to distribute the income that we have in society? I assume we wouldn't suggest that in 30 years we're going to have no income, right?
Sure.
We're going to have a ton
Hopefully
of people
not.
working and a ton of these non-workers. The rates hovered around 50-50 essentially for the last, fucking like 40 years or something like that, right? And it was lower back in the 1940s and 50s because women didn't work. And so, for all those reasons, that's why I keep bringing it back. I understand you guys' questions, but fundamentally, we need the welfare state, even in a society with all those problems that you're talking about. And I would argue that even in that society, we should have a relatively expansive welfare state, perhaps relative to the time, because maybe there's less income and maybe we have depreciation and stuff, but we still need a wide welfare state.
Okay, a substantive amount of these, though, are not questions. They're statements. They're problems that you and I are coming up with that are effectively going to affect the way that we said. And then you're using what I would say is pretty sanitized language in order to describe things that are actually kind of like worrisome to the fiscal and social conservatives of the country.
But I can agree, Conor, and that doesn't change my point, though.
Hold on. So you're saying something like, well, it's a distribution issue.
It is.
Okay, I'm not stupid. So what I see when the population goes down and that we only have so many options, which is immigration, and you say it's a distribution issue, what you're saying is more taxes. Well, for better or worse, fiscal...
What are you talking about?
I would love to hear how we need to increase distribution without increasing taxes.
Replicators like in Star Trek.
Well, we're not there yet.
Yeah,
so
replicators in Star
we're
Trek.
not there yet. We're not there technologically. So then the question becomes, so you're saying it's a question of distribution. You're saying like, oh, we can just increase this tax like 0.75%. People won't even notice. It's not that big of a deal. Who cares?
Not what I said.
Well, I feel like I remember that from about 30 minutes ago. But the point that is that I like to think of myself as a fairly rational, statist, Burkean conservative some of the time. People hate that, but that's the way that I feel. Everyone else is to the right of me on this issue. They want more fiscal conservatism. They want less taxes. They don't want more.
Well, these are not incompatible conversations.
It's an issue of volume.
Yeah.
So if the excess resources generated per person is, let's just say, like 1% of a labor unit, whatever that means. Let's say a human requires 80 labor units. I'm using a fictional thing to represent value. And they produce 100. That means one person doing work will provide an excess of 20. Now, hold on. That person wants that 20 for themselves. I get to go to the movies. I don't have to work on the weekends. So when we decide we're going to tax a portion of the units they produce, if we take one unit of labor from that person, they might not notice and say, okay, fine, at least I got enough time off on the weekends. But that one is not going to sustain a single individual. If you have 100 million people and they're all working, you're now generating a ton of excess labor, which can be distributed as a welfare state. But with a population collapse, your volume is going to decrease and the total amount will exponentially decrease that you can support in a welfare state due to a decrease in volume. In standard business, this requires a price increase. You can either sell 1 million widgets for $1, or you can sell one widget for $1 million if you want to pay your bills.
Yeah, so Conor Boy, the question is, is your answer to that problem, because Tim and I have brought this problem up repeatedly, is your answer effectively automation, integration, better tax structure?
Well, yes and no. So I already said about 45 minutes ago or something like that, pretty close to the beginning of the conversation, that it's entirely possible that if we become South Korea 20 or 30 years from now, right, where we have just
demographically, you mean?
Yeah, demographically, right. So we're very skeptical on immigration. People aren't having kids, right, and we have this huge demographic imbalance. It's very possible that we'll have to cut benefits because of some fiscal sustainability issues, right? Like eventually you probably don't have enough money to distribute at current levels, but we have benefits that are tied to inflation, and if deflation happens, you just lower the benefits commensurately, right? It's all about achieving what we think of as a relative standard of living. And when I say relative, I mean to the time. So it's possible that what you're saying does happen. Maybe in 20 or 30 years, nobody's having any kids, innovations go down, we're just kind of poor, right? For various reasons. We just don't have the money to redistribute like we used to. And so we'll have to adjust our expectations of what basic needs means, like you said. But that's not a comment on how much, relatively speaking, within societies we should distribute to people who are struggling with these things that I talked about.
So
you can have the exact.
Why are you so hopeful? It pisses me off.
No, well, I'm not hopeful. It's just
Optimism.
Yeah, he's like it'll be fine. We'll figure it out. We'll dial it in, guys.
No,
And I'm
because
just like, what?
Okay, think
what?
about it. Like Tim said. So let's say that we have, I don't know, like we have $5 trillion that we want to redistribute, right? And maybe about that's what government spending is,
We
right?
should, before, I don't know how much time we have, but
Another hour.
Okay, so then we will talk about debt, servicing the debt,
but
all that kind of stuff.
Let's say that we have $5 trillion that we want to redistribute. That's what we can kind of like afford, quotation marks.
Sure.
And we distribute it based on, these different groups that I talked about, and like maybe we have some military needs or whatever that is. And we go into the future and all these calamitous things happen. And let's just say, God, damn, we can only raise $4 trillion, right? Like that's like the most we can raise. Well, distributionally, there's no reason to think that we would all of a sudden not have unemployment benefits. We would not have retirement benefits. We would not have maybe a basic income. We would not have student benefits. Maybe those benefits just have to go down some amount, right? But fundamentally, just last thing, we need welfare, and we need a lot of it, relatively speaking, to prevent all these people from living in poverty.
I'm not a minarchist or an anarchist.
I was going to say this real quick because you brought up U.S. debt, so I brought up the U.S. debt clock. I think it's fair to say that we've already traveled well beyond the capability of the welfare system, and now the ship is sinking, and we're pretending like it's not.
Yeah.
122% debt to GDP.
Japan's at like 240.
We have, there's, you have to look at sort of taxes as a percent of GDP, like how much does the United States tax compared to other countries? The only thing I was going to say was the reason why we run such high deficits is because we just choose to. Like, we could obviously tax more and solve the fiscal problems that we have. And you absolutely could.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon. So subscribe and come hang out.